ever heard of a place being renamed?
Yeah.
To like better reflect modern values,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's what we're diving into today, this debate around Wilberforce House. It's in Hull, England.
Okay.
And it was the home of a really famous abolitionist, but now people are talking about renaming it, and it's sparking all these conversations about how we handle, these historical legacies.
It's fascinating, right? Because it brings up this challenge. How do we really honor the complexities of individuals and their impact? Especially, when it's all tied up with something as awful as the slave trade.
Yeah, that's what makes this so interesting to me. It's not like a simple yes or no answer.
Right.
So for our listeners, let's set the scene a little bit. We're looking at Wilberforce House, the home of William Wilberforce, who, as I said, was dedicated to fighting against the slave trade in the British Empire.
Mm-hmm.
But his story and the house itself are now at the center of this debate. Should it be renamed?
Yeah, it's really not straightforward. I think
Uh-huh.
to really get the arguments, it helps to understand that this is part of a bigger trend. Renaming places associated with slavery or colonialism.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Like we've seen examples recently, like Fort Bragg in North Carolina,
Oh, right.
which was renamed to Fort Liberty
Yeah.
because the original name had Confederate ties.
Yeah, and then there's that town in Mexico that was originally called San Lorenzo de los Negros, which was later renamed to Yanga after a leader who fought against slavery. It makes you think about, who are we choosing to honor and why?
Exactly.
And it's not just the U.S. and Mexico, right?
No, not at all. Even in Canada, there's this whole debate happening about renaming the Great Slave Lake. Some argue it honors the indigenous slavey people, while others find the term just offensive, no matter where it came from.
It definitely feels like part of a much larger conversation.
For sure.
But let's bring it back to Wilberforce House. To understand the debate, we should probably start with William Wilberforce himself. Who was he?
Okay, so he was born in 1759 in the very house that's now the museum. He later became a member of Parliament.
Oh, wow.
And he was really influenced by his Christian faith, which really fueled his passion for social justice.
I see.
And, his fight against the slave trade in the British Empire was a big part of that.
And it wasn't just talk, right? He really dedicated his life to this cause.
Oh, absolutely. He campaigned tirelessly, not just against slavery, but for things like animal welfare.
Oh, wow.
And improving people's lives in general. He was a true social reformer of his time.
Okay, so we've got this prominent figure living in a house that later became a museum about him and the slave trade. But here's where it gets really interesting to me. You mentioned that Hull itself wasn't directly involved in the slave trade.
Right, that's right. Hull mainly traded with Europe, not the Americas. But, and this is really important, the city still benefited from goods produced by enslaved people. Think sugar, coffee.
Oh, right. Everyday things back then.
Exactly, everyday commodities.
So while they weren't sailing slave ships across the Atlantic, they were still participating in and profiting from the system that relied on slave labor.
Right.
That adds a whole other layer to this debate, doesn't it?
It really does, yeah. And it's this complicated connection to slavery that fuels a lot of the arguments for renaming Wilberforce House. One core argument is that focusing on Wilberforce kind of unintentionally puts the spotlight on him
Right.
rather than on the victims of slavery.
I see what you mean. It's like we're prioritizing the person who helped end a terrible system over the people who suffered because of it.
Exactly, and it brings up the question, shouldn't the narrative center on those who endured the horrors of the slave trade?
That makes a lot of sense.
Uh-huh.
What other arguments are there for renaming?
Well, another point is that Wilberforce, while he fought against the slave trade, his views on racial equality weren't exactly progressive,
Oh, right.
even for his time. I mean, some of his statements would be considered just racist today.
Yeah, that raises a big question then. Should we be celebrating someone who, while accomplishing great things, also held views that are now considered, reprehensible?
Mm-hmm.
And does that celebration, even with acknowledging his flaws, overshadow the suffering caused by the system that he fought against?
Yeah, exactly. And that leads to a third argument for renaming. Proponents say that instead of highlighting the actions of a white British man, the museum should prioritize the stories and experiences of those directly impacted by slavery, amplifying African voices that were silenced for so long.
So it's about shifting the focus away from this kind of savior narrative.
Right.
And towards the experiences of those who actually endured the horrors of slavery. But I imagine there are also compelling arguments against renaming, right?
Oh, absolutely. We'll delve into those after a quick break to refresh our thinking caps.
We've been talking about some pretty compelling arguments for renaming Wilberforce House, but I'm sure there's another side to this story. What are the reasons people give for keeping the name as it is?
Well, one of the big ones is that we have to acknowledge Wilberforce's huge role in actually abolishing the slave trade. You know, his dedication, his years of campaigning, all those influential speeches he gave in Parliament.
Right.
I mean, those efforts really did contribute to that monumental change.
Yeah, it's true that he was a driving force in that whole movement, even if his personal views were kind of complex. But doesn't the museum already address the horrors of the slave trade? It's not like they're just ignoring that part of history, are they?
That's a good point. You're right to bring that up. Wilberforce House isn't just a tribute to the man himself. They have exhibits that really detail the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade.
Hmm.
You know, the awful conditions on the ships, and they share personal stories of the people who were enslaved.
Oh, wow.
There's even this really powerful model of a slave ship called the Brooks that really gives you a visual sense of just how appalling the conditions were for the people on board.
So it sounds like they're trying to at least provide a more balanced perspective. They're not shying away from the darker parts of the story.
Exactly. And this ties into another argument for keeping the name learning from history. The idea is that Wilberforce's story, including his imperfections and inconsistencies,
Right.
can actually teach us something valuable about how views on race and equality have evolved over time.
Yeah, instead of trying to erase or ignore those uncomfortable parts of the past, maybe we can use them as a way to learn and understand how societal views have shifted and hopefully avoid repeating those same mistakes.
That's the thinking. And those who are for keeping the name often talk about how the museum is trying to be even more inclusive, you know?
Yeah.
They've been adding more African voices and perspectives to the exhibits, highlighting Black abolitionists and activists, and really trying to tell the story of slavery from different angles.
So they're acknowledging the complexities of Wilberforce's legacy, but they're also expanding a narrative beyond just one potentially problematic figure.
Exactly. And it's not just Wilberforce House. This whole trend of reevaluating how we present history is happening in museums and historical sites all over the world. There's a real movement to decolonize these institutions and offer a more well-rounded and inclusive view of the past.
It seems like this debate is much bigger than just erasing history or canceling Wilberforce.
Yeah.
It's about finding a way to talk about his legacy in a way that's honest but also sensitive to everyone who is involved.
You put that really well. It requires us to be open to having uncomfortable conversations, to
Right.
challenge what we think we know, and to really truly consider the perspectives of those who have been marginalized throughout history.
Yeah, it's recognizing that history isn't always a simple story.
Right.
It's messy, full of contradictions, and rarely black and white.
Right.
But I think that's what makes it so fascinating.
Yeah, I agree. But that same complexity can also make it really tough to figure out, what does this debate mean for us, for everyday people trying to understand these complicated historical figures?
That's the question that keeps coming for me, too. How do we reconcile these seemingly opposing ideas? On the one hand, Wilberforce was key in ending the transatlantic slave trade, which is undeniably a good thing. On the other hand, some of his views on race were, let's just say, problematic at best.
That's such a great question. And I think it's one we can explore further. I mean, this isn't just some academic exercise. This debate really does have implications for how we deal with issues of race and equality today.
So it feels like we're kind of wrestling with this really big question here. How do we as individuals grapple with these really complex historical figures and their legacies? It's so easy to just get caught up in that good versus bad binary.
Yeah, it really is. And I think this is where it becomes so important to move beyond just memorizing names and dates. History is really about understanding the nuances of human behavior, their motivations, and how those actions have ripple effects, that continue throughout time.
It's about asking those so what questions.
Oh.
Like, okay, so Wilberforce campaigned for abolition, so what? What does that actually tell us about the society that he was living in?
Right.
What can we learn from his successes, but also his flaws?
Exactly. And that's where this whole renaming debate becomes really interesting. It forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths about the past. How do we reconcile the fact that someone who fought for human rights could also hold views that we now consider, deeply harmful?
Yeah, it's like trying to hold these two totally opposing ideas in our minds at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Wilberforce was a huge part of abolishing the transatlantic slave trade, which is obviously a good thing.
Yeah.
But he also held some views that are, well, let's just say they don't exactly line up with our modern understanding of racial equality.
Right. And that's the heart of it. We can't just erase the uncomfortable parts of history or pretend that people in the past thought exactly like we do today. It's more about understanding the context of the time that they lived in, while also acknowledging the harm that those outdated beliefs caused.
So it seems like the goal isn't to just label historical figures as heroes or villains, but to try to recognize their complexities, their contradictions, and the context that they were living in.
We can.
You appreciate their accomplishments, but also critique, their flaws.
Exactly. And this is where I think places like Wilberforce House are so important. They can provide that context, the multiple perspectives, the primary sources that help us really understand the past, with all its messiness.
And from what we've discussed, it sounds like Wilberforce House is really trying to do that.
Yeah.
They're not just saying Wilberforce is a perfect hero, right?
Right.
They're teaching people about the horrors of slavery, incorporating those African voices and highlighting the work of other abolitionists.
Yes, they're making a real effort to make the story bigger and to engage with these tough questions. And I think that's key. It's not about finding a perfect solution or erasing problematic figures from history altogether. It's more about creating a space to have these open and honest conversations about the past and how it still impacts us today.
So where does that leave our listeners? Should they be running out to sign a petition to rename Wilberforce House, or should they be boycotting it completely?
I don't think it has to be that black and white. I think the best thing anyone can do is just engage with the issue thoughtfully. Learn about Wilberforce, about the slave trade, about the arguments on both sides. Consider all the nuances and the complexities that we've talked about.
And maybe even visit Wilberforce House or another museum that's dealing with a complicated historical legacy. See how they present the information, what choices they made, and how those choices affect the visitors.
That's a great idea. It's a chance to really wrestle with these questions firsthand, because in the end, this debate is about so much more than just one man or one building. It's about how we as a society choose to remember the past and how that shapes how we see the present and the future.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that history isn't static or fixed. It's a living, breathing thing that we're constantly reinterpreting and recontextualizing. So to our listeners, we'll leave you with this. What criteria should we use when we think about renaming places or monuments dedicated to people who are now considered controversial? Where do we draw the line between acknowledging what they did and condemning past injustices?
This is tough, right? There aren't any easy answers, but just having these conversations is such an important step towards a more informed and equitable future. And with that, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the complexities of history, memory, and representation. Thanks for joining us.